My name is Omar Kombi, the marketing assistant here at SALCC-VALIRI Community College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second seminar in our collaboration with VALIRI. And this session will focus on unlocking global graduate opportunities, a toolkit for Caribbean university students. We know as Caribbean people, our greatest resource is our people, but oftentimes we face challenges in upskilling them and building capacity. So this session hopes to allow for greater awareness and greater sensitization on what are the pathways necessary in terms of pursuing graduate studies and excelling at them. So without further ado, I would pass it over to our two chairs of the session, I believe, Dr. Aviane Auguste and Dr. Drexler James.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So like Omar said, Aviane Auguste, professor of epidemiology at McGill University. My work is mostly in cancer disparities, epidemiology, and now I work a lot in developing populations like the Caribbean. And this morning, I'm joined with Drexler. Can you introduce himself?
Yes, I'm Drexler James. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. And I study the social psychological determinants of health and health behavior.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to just show you very briefly what VALIRI is. This is a popular question a lot of people ask, and it's just very valid. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then we're going to start at the first part of our session, which has to do with advice from a more seasoned person like Drex and myself. The second part is now opening the floor to our current graduate students who are here with us in person, who will give us details of their current work and what they are doing currently, how they're experiencing grad school. Right, so what is VALIRI very quickly? So VALIRI was launched in 2016 and created by the SALCC-VALIRI Community College because there's a need to build capacity in this area. Hence, we have VALIRI being formed. Not to be confused with SALCC-VALIRI Community College are two distinct entities with their own distinct governance. That's something that I need to know. But however, they do have a hand-in-glove partnership and they work very closely. So as you can see today, we're in the premises of SALCC-VALIRI Community College doing this seminar. So the way we work is that, think of it as a melting pot of different organizations coming together to bring collective skills and resources under one umbrella. And with these collective resources, what we do is that we try to create new knowledge for sustainable development in the Caribbean by working with leveraging communities, groups, and organizations, such as in the case of my work, Faces of Cancer Saint Lucia, we work a lot together. And then since we speak of sustainable development, those who are well versed in this will correspond to good health and well-being. Right, so just to show examples of VALIRI in action. So one of the big pillars that we look at is research. Some of the things that we looked at previously is trying to assess evidence of community health fairs to enhance uptake of cancer screening in developing countries. So as you can see, there's a publication that came out last year, leveraging several persons. At the time, I was a postdoc. We also had a student I was supervising. And you can see, they can appreciate that there's this combination of persons who are physically residing in Saint Lucia, as well as leveraging persons from the diaspora to do this work together. So it's a bit of the strength of VALIRI currently. Just a little plug in here, the CASADEC research study. You'll hear a lot about this in the coming days. This is not the global presentation, but we're doing a multi-center study in 6 Caribbean islands in the OECS particularly. And so more of that to follow later. So capacity building is another big pillar. As you can see, we want to do this through training, mentorship, and seminars like the one we have here. It's a picture of us sometime last year with our visiting researcher, Dr. Patricia St. Louis, who did a seminar on health system strengthening. So all this is contributing to building research capacity. All right, so we now reach to the reason why we're all here this morning, advice on how to navigate graduate studies. So we're going to just go through section by section, and it's more like a conversation we're having. And if there are any questions, we can take them as we go along. But there's a Q&A section that one word at the end of this. All right, so I just don't want to.
No. And so the whole idea is to have a conversation with you. So we're going to start off like sectioning off like the process. So like, what is a PhD? What does the application process look like? What does the evaluation process look like? And some miscellaneous questions. And then you can ask in between each of the portions, but we'll dedicate 20 minutes at the end for more general questions. And so if you perceive that your question is something very specific to your situation, I ask that you hold it till 20 minutes or even after. And so what we'll be doing is just like going through common questions that people always ask about this process. I've done this multiple times. So what is a PhD?
Good question.
What is a PhD? When you hear like someone has a PhD, what comes to mind?
Highest level of education.
Highest level of education.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Research. Expert in the field. Asterisk.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the nuance. Yeah, and so PhD is a research degree. I think oftentimes we think about like PhDs as just like something like a bachelor's or master's degree, but a lot, en route to getting a PhD, you engage in a lot of research projects, hypothesis testing, data collection, data analysis. And because of that, a PhD is oftentimes a full-time job. Unless you're doing a professional PhD, like a doctor of education or doctor of psychology, it's like a PsyD, you will be going to school full time. That's just the nature of the game.
And just to add to that, the PhD is, when you look at it, is one of the very few degrees which are innately practical, very practice-based. So it's almost like an apprenticeship where of course, there's a theoretical part that you learn, but you're learning through practice. So you're learning to do research by doing research. So the basic principle across the board in all countries, at least from to my knowledge. And so, so it's a full-time job, not something that you can engage in it part-time, but you want to make sure that it's something that you dedicate full time, but all your time, well, a lot of time too, because you are practicing and you want to practice your craft as much as possible to be able to perfect it.
Yeah, and noting the word apprentice, right? And so oftentimes you work with a mentor or a group of mentors to help you develop your research skill. And so again, it's not like a master's degree where you're just taking classes and graduating. And so in a PhD program, oftentimes you'll have a mentor or a group of mentors who will help guide your research progress. So which is always interesting, but that's always fun. Okay.
So you can probably pass the next question. What does it mean to complete a PhD? What does that look like? All right. So we know there are the classes, right? That can take different shapes or form. But usually starts with an enrollment. There's some classes and then terminates with a PhD defense. Or in some cases in the UK, they call it a viva, I believe, right? And so we might not be able to cover all the intermediate steps and the milestones, but we're glad to answer those questions afterwards. And if you have anything to add on that part.
Yeah, and so what it means to complete a PhD is, in theory, you'd be an expert in theory, an expert in your niche area of research. And so I study internalized racism and its impact on health, and I'll argue that I probably am one of the experts on internalized racism globally. And what does it mean to also, it's like, you become very, 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 very focused in what you do. And so I'm a social psychologist, and social psychology is this broad, but my research area is probably like 1% of 1% of social psychology. So if you were to ask me about research on like attachment, I would know it. I still don't know it, even though, it's something a social psychologist should know. And so what we have, again, is just like expertise in a very niche area.
Yeah, so talking about niche, just to speak about some of what I do. So yes, I'm a cancer epidemiologist, which is already itself a division within the discipline of epi. And in my research study at McGill, I focus a lot on cancer epidemiology, but in the developing world and trying to understand how to bring prevention to those persons who don't have the necessary sources to do it, as we would see in developed countries. So that in itself is extremely niche. And then you go further and then we start talking about how to do this in small island developing states, which is, I don't think anyone else in the world is doing that.
Yeah.
All right. So we go to why we should pursue a PhD. So I think we should do a PhD because it sounds nice calling ourselves doctors sometimes. Well, all jokes aside, you do it because I think first and foremost there's a passion for research. You have to want to be curious. There's certain like human qualities that you want to have before you jump into that. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of uncertainty to navigate, but I think ultimately you want to make sure that there's some passion for the activity of doing research and that level of inquiry, because it's what we do in our jobs. We think a lot, we ask a lot of questions, we want to challenge certain status quo, and you want to make sure that you're doing this, not just, so your friends can call you Dr. X or Dr. Y.
And then thinking about like, what do you hope to do at the end of your PhD? And so if you want to be a lifelong researcher, get a PhD. If you don't, get a professional doctorate. And so, for example, in psychology, there's a doctor of psychology and there's a PhD in psychology. The PsyD degree, so doctor of psychology degree, is very practice focused. You do little to no research in that program compared to a PhD program that is often, like, well, it's almost exclusively research focused. Even in some clinical psychology PhD programs, some students don't really engage in like practica. They do the bare minimum for APA accreditation. Or you can get a PhD in education if you want to do research in education settings, or you can get a doctorate of education. And so those professional doctorates are very, very different from a PhD in the area. And so if you want to be a researcher, get a PhD. If you don't want to be a researcher, get a professional doctorate. And then the difference there is, and we'll get into it, is that PhD programs are often fully funded in the US and Canada, at least, but professional doctorates tend to not be. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Drexler knows a bit more about the professional doctorate than I do. I don't know if you want to go number 4. Okay, so how long does it take to complete a PhD? You can maybe take a quick poll to see what people think, the a priori ideas on how long it takes.
Yeah, how long does it take to complete a PhD?
Let's poll the room quickly. 5 years. 5 to 7. It's a long time. Anyone can say better? What would you say if I said it could be done flat in 3 years' time?
For asterisk, with the asterisk. But that's the asterisk. Yes. Yes.
So there is a lot of like variability based on the country, the university, the program, the discipline. Sometimes some disciplines take longer than others. So I would give, if I had to give a window, I would say, let's say 3 to 6.
7, 8, 9, we'll go. Yeah. Yeah. And so, yes. So the length of the PhD really depends on like the individual's motivation, but also funding.
Yeah.
And so in the US, for example, the average PhD is about 7 years. And you can apply to a PhD program in the US right after undergrad. And so that's what I did, straight from undergrad, enrolled in a PhD program. And that took me 5 years. Some people will enroll in a PhD program after a master's degree, and will still take them 5 years or 6 years. Some people enroll after a bachelor's degree and it takes them 7 years. And so it really, really depends on the individual's motivation. In psychology, at least, the average length for getting a PhD in the US is about 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, just to compare that with where I trained in France, for example, the ministry, higher learning really explicitly wants a lot of these doctorates to be done in 3 years, no more. If you're doing it part-time, this could take 6 years, but it just makes sense because you're dividing your time dedicated to that work in half, so it will double. But in reality, the goal is to get it done in 3 years. A lot of the stipends and the scholarships, they tell you 3 years, no more. You might get an opportunity to extend by another year, but usually that's the standard. You do see some heterogeneity across disciplines. So public health, where I did my training, 3 years is pretty much a standard. Maybe in humanities, like sociology, this could take 4, 5, 6 years.
That's 3 years post-master's or 3 years post-bachelor?
So that's 3 years post-master's.
Okay.
So you need a master's degree in that setting to be able to do that. You cannot just go from bachelor's and
but in North America, you can go from bachelor straight into a PhD program.
Yeah,
so that's like the difference. And so in the US, some programs have a terminal master's degree. And so en route to getting your PhD, you'll still do a master's thesis. And so where I went to school, so University of Illinois at Chicago, after the second year, you do get a master's degree. And if you're like, I'm done with this, you leave with a master's. And in my current program at the University of Minnesota, we don't have a terminal master's degree. And so we're just having that discussion. And so students enrolled in the program just graduates with a PhD. Yeah, but we had literally just had the discussion about, someone did like plan B masters where they submitted coursework I was like, oh yeah, you earned a master's degree. But that's mostly because they were applying to internships. Yeah, and they needed to show that they had a master's degree. But it depends on the program, because the idea for some programs is that you've committed and then you're gonna graduate with the degree, you know. Yeah. Good question.
Any other questions? Okay, so since now we're all excited about doing a PhD, right?
Yeah.
We're gonna now cover what we need to enter the program now and what that process looks like. Fun.
Oh yeah.
So the first talking point here is, what are the typical requirements for applying to a PhD program? So Drexler, you can maybe give insight because you've been here a bit longer than me. So
yeah, and so I'll give again from the North America, so like US, Canada perspective on what is required. Oftentimes there's like a GPA threshold. I think some institutions it's like 3.2. It's never 3.2 because actually there's a selection effect that people who apply for PhD tend to be more better academically, but there will be a minimum GPA requirement. If you're the GMAT specifically is for business school, the GRE oftentimes is for just like any other discipline, and there's subject GREs. And so GRE is just a standardized test.
Okay,
just like
SAT
general
almost?
knowledge. It's like language, math, and like writing, but no one cares. Like quantitative, yeah, no one really cares about the writing part. And so the GRE, but that's changed increasingly in the US because of concerns about equity, disparities across gender, ethno-racial groups. But so in some programs, the GRE is required. So taking that exam is required and your scores are important. Some programs submitting the score is optional. And so if you want to take the GRE, you can and submit your scores. And in some programs, it's not required at all. And that varies within department. And so in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota, we have 7 distinct programs. Each program has their own requirements. And so social psychology GREs are not required. In the personality and individual differences and, oh God, what's it? Oh God, the genetics part. It's optional, and in clinical, it's required. So even within departments, we have different expectations. In the US, you submit what's called like a research or personal statement, and it kind of blends. And it's more or less like a document expressing your interest for conducting research. And so in that statement, you talk about what you want to study while in graduate school. You reflect on your experiences, oftentimes like what research training you have. You'll oftentimes talk about why you might fit with a mentor, and we'll talk about that, how you find a research supervisor. And the diversity statement itself is specific to the US. I don't know the extent to which this is gonna last given the new administration. But oftentimes the diversity statement just, your own personal reflections on your identities and your experiences and how they've like shaped or influenced your interest in a specific research topic. And so that's mostly it. So GPA, GRE, research statement, diversity statement, and of course, letters of recommendations. And letters of recommendations, not from your supervisor, not from your friend, not from your boss. Letters of recommendations that whole way come from other researchers. And so if another researcher is not writing a letter of recommendation, chances are your application is not going to be taken seriously. Because the idea is like, how can someone evaluate your research training if they're not a researcher themselves? Yeah, and so that's the idea.
yeah, so just to complete what Drexler just said, so I can speak to first and foremost the Canadian context, and I'll give you the contrast with what I do in France. So to add to this, what we do when we have our admissions committee, sometimes we might see people, we might ask students to list, in their application, their publications that they've had. I don't know how it is in psych, but in public health and epi, we want to, it's a bonus, it's an important thing to show that you have some capacity to do research already, even though the degree is to learn how to do research. Anyways,
yeah, that's like
so let me see. That's a big thing. So for what I know in France now, so there's a lot less gatekeeping in France. We're speaking of just enrolling into the school, right? We're not talking about funding just yet. So if you just want to enroll, there is like a threshold in terms of academic excellence that you need to achieve. So to gain access to the program. So would be often you see times in natural sciences are asking for a grading of your terminal master's degree of 12 out of 20, which is equivalent to like a kind of like an honors, first class honors kind of level. So this is kind of your top of, yeah, so you need to show demonstrate some level of expertise in your discipline, academic excellence. So that's the threshold is kind of 12 out of 20. And then if you go into more humanities, I've seen them asking for a bit more. So 16 out of 20. This may mean nothing to most people, but 12 out of 20 for natural sciences is quite good. Let's just put it that way. So there's a lot less grade inflation. So, but I think most persons, if you're serious about research, you do a good master's thesis, you're most likely eligible to get in. I know very few persons who, struggle to meet that threshold. Apart from that, I think they may ask you for an equivalent of a personal statement, which would be a motivational letter just to say, why I want to go into the school. But it's a lot less, gatekeeping. Usually once you meet that minimum requirement, you're able to enter and enroll, no problem. The other thing is now, if you're asking for funding, a funded position, then this will look differently. There are other things you need to really put into your application to get funding, but just baseline, get into the program. If you want to do it with no money, just like on your own, have your, I don't know, take a loan or have your spouse pay school for you, or then this is very much streamlined. There's not really a quota per se, the number of persons that need to be admitted in France or in the schools. Whereas in Canada and North America, like in my program, there's a quota of like the 20 people to get into the PhD of Epi.
Yes, we have a quota, yes. So in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota last year, we had 800 applications for 17 spots. And so that's just like how it goes. Yeah.
Ours is not as bad. Let's say around maybe 90 for 20 spots, but it's still cutthroat. And you see sometimes people come in with free publications already, and they're like, not really, we don't want that. We want more, So, and it depends on the developer parameters to take into account, right? But for one thing for sure in France, there's the questions of quota is less of a problem. I think once you have a supervisor that is willing to take you on and he has, funding or not, then, these questions are secondary. So speaking of supervisors, do I need to secure a supervisor before applying? Any thoughts on that, Drexler?
It helps. Yeah. And so you could put in your personal statement, as I mentioned earlier, you talk about like your research. If you have research interest, then you've scanned the page, for example, the psych department at the University of Minnesota, you've identified someone who does research in the area that they're interested in. And so in your personal or research statement, you would explicitly state that I'm applying to this program because I want to work with this person who can mentor me achieve my research goals. And so in that capacity, you've already identified someone in the program. Some people will write, a research statement that just generally says that they're interested in something and identify no one. And I read these applications very differently. And so the person who mentions my name has probably read my paper, or in this day and age, the abstract of a paper, which is, better than someone who doesn't mention my name. But I also only read applications that mention my name. Yeah, because there's just like so many. And so if I'm not identified, I don't go through the other like 90 applications trying to find someone. And so in rare cases, a colleague would be like, oh, this person applied to work with me, but I think it might be better fit with you. And that happened with one of my students, but I didn't even read her application, but she's my student. Yeah, and that happens. And so it's important to do that. And I know in the biomedical sciences in the US, at least, you need to have a research supervisor. And we'll talk about why that's important for funding purposes, like in biology, chemistry, biomedical, engineering. Oftentimes, funding comes from the research supervisor specifically. And so you need to mention them, right? You have to be interested in the work that they're doing, but we'll get to that.
All right, so my understanding of how it works in Canada is very similar. So you can get in based on academic merit. So I have a 4.0 GPA. The best thing that happens since sliced bread, and you put in your application, and at least in McGill, we do value that, and you can get on our PhD program with the supervisor. There's a little mechanism that we have where we kind of pair you up with somebody as time goes by, but we put a lot of emphasis on academic excellence and also in the effort of being more equitable and having more diversity. We do this for that reason. But I think across the board, you speak to colleagues, like Drexler mentioned, having a supervisor makes a big difference. It, can play between two candidates who are strong academically, the one for supervisor most likely get in than the one without. So as much as, for the previous point, France were very open, not much keeping happening, it's kind of almost impossible to enroll into a PhD program in France without a supervisor. The supervisor in France is the key to open that door to start a program. That doesn't happen. And you cannot just have anyone supervise you. In France, is a very specific certification that researchers need. It's called a habilitation dirigée de recherche. We just call it HDR for short. That is something that, you kind of do 10 years after your PhD, or in that time, 6 to 10 years. And that is what enables us as researchers to supervise PhD students. Whereas in North America, you're appointed as an assistant professor, and day one, you can recruit people, no problem. You could know nothing about supervision, and you'll allow you to supervise these human beings.
We can talk about that. But then there are other programs, for example, in sociology. So I know sociology at Ohio State and even sociology at Vanderbilt, where you get admitted to the program. And so you don't need a supervisor in sociology at OSU or Vanderbilt. You get admitted to the program, and then you find someone to mentor you. And some people often jump between supervisors over time. In psychology, it's almost expected that you will be the same person throughout your entire time. And it's almost scandalous when someone switches advisors. It's oftentimes like an interpersonal thing, or it might just be research interests no longer overlap. Yeah, and so again, going back to that apprenticeship mentee mentor model.
Yeah, so that's something that happens a lot, even in Canada. I arrived in my position, I was appalled at the fact that someone could just be like, oh, I changed my mind. I changed my mind out of my topic. I'm going to do something else. Bye-bye, and I'm going to just go with the professor down the hall. That happens. Yeah. In France, no. You have to really be in conflict, serious conflict or tension with your supervisor to be able to divorce them. And it's a whole process. The doctoral school has to get involved. And I got the feeling in North America, it's like, okay, I'm changing my mind. Let's go.
You fill out the forms, which advisors. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something to think about. And then maybe just something about next line. I don't know how to find a suitable supervisor or advisor.
Research, it's kind of weird, but you have to do research. So the idea, again, going back to, if you're applying to a PhD program, you probably have an idea of what research area you're interested in, and your idea of what theories you want to advance. And so, as given that this is a mentee-mentor apprenticeship model, you have to find the person who engages in similar or explicitly the same
how do we find them
that you're interested in. And so how do you find them? You go on a lot of university pages. And so my process was like, okay, I'm interested in this topic. So I'm interested in getting a PhD in psychology. I looked up the top 50 PhD programs in psychology in the US. And I went through every single faculty page to identify am I interested? And I did 3 passes. And so I had my long list and my long short list, because then I was interested in social psychology, but I even ended up applying to community psychology programs, just because of the nature of people's research interests. And so that's the process of, or sometimes you just I've read 10 of this person's papers, I really like them. You might want to work with them. But I took the wide net approach.
So let me just add to that. So that's one way about doing it. I mean, my path was a bit different. But what that helps a lot, at least when we have the privilege of being at McGill or Minnesota, where we have these big universities and there's seminars every other day, you can just go up to one of these speakers and be like, hey, I love your talk, great work. Are you looking for someone? And that's a good way to engage them and start a conversation, because it's easier to develop a rapport and feel for the person rather than a cold email on a Monday morning where you're not in the mood and you're just, So I think that's a good way. Whenever we have even today, a seminar like this one, where 2 capable researchers, able to supervise, this is an opportunity for persons to come in and interact and have a informal interview going on. And
yes, and the cold emails sometimes do work. I get a lot of cold emails in the fall, so from September to when applications are due, and I usually just delete them. But once in a while, someone will have something very interesting, oh, you actually read my work. You seem to be very curious, and I'll actually meet with them. via Zoom and have a discussion. So like my current grad student, he had like messaged me. I was like, well, this is very interesting. And we met like 2 or 3 times. He applied and I accepted him. But then most people, I just delete the email.
But that was my experience. I do want to interject here because in terms of choosing your advisor, I do recall that your first semester in graduate school, you got an opportunity to take courses and to kind of figure out what lab you wanted to be in. I was in a chemistry master's student. And it was I think that was a really good mode or method because in a bachelor's degree, you don't always have time to do extensive research depending on what university you went to. So you kind of, how do you know this is going to work? Basically, is what the first semester is about. So you get an opportunity to kind of go to different labs and see, get along your lab mates. Because you kind of work shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah.
For 2.5 years. So it was a really nice experience. And I think doing the coursework, it helps to kind of open you up a bit more to what area that you're more interested in. There's also the teaching assistant.
Yeah,
we talked about
We
that.
talked about it, where so in terms of funding and so forth, which helps support.
Yeah.
Journey. So I had a completely different experience where I did not choose my supervisor, my advisor until maybe the 7th semester, and then you kind of went into the lab. So you're lucky if you get that before.
Yes.
Yes, I think it's also possible to kind of figure out along the way, and to be afforded the time to do so. I think it's nice.
Yeah, like just to mention like the sociology program, so you have that opportunity to just like you get admitted and you figure it out. I don't want that type of student, and so it just becomes like you can figure it out on your own time. That's like my approach, and so if you're not specifically interested in what I'm interested in, I don't care, and I just don't admit people like that who are like I'm interested in this thing broadly related, and it's like go develop it somewhere else. And so again, this depends on like who the mentor is, but also the culture of the program. And yeah, and so yes, but I do think that approach is probably better, especially for people coming straight from undergrad. You're still like developing like your research interests. You're still not really sure what you're particularly interested in. You get more exposure when you take courses, and so your interests might change over time. You become a different person in 5 years. But yeah, so when you're stuck with the mentorship program in psychology, it becomes very contentious when you're like, I changed my mind. And then it becomes like, I just sank 3 years into mentoring you. Now, yeah, and so that becomes, yes, oh, yeah. But yeah. And so the answer is yes, you can, straight from bachelor's degree in North America. You do not need a master's degree, although increasingly, me and some of my colleagues are realizing that people with master's degrees, at least on average, tend to be more socio-emotionally developed than people with just bachelor's degrees, or just people with like no work experience. And so you can have a bachelor's degree with work experience. And that's obviously for me preferred at this point.
Just to complete, well, for France, this is not possible, unfortunately, to go on a route. You need a master's degree, but it's all cool. I did it, I survived, right? So you can just, what does the application timeline look like typically? So in North America, usually I think December, in the fall,
November, December
is the time where applications are due. So all now, so prospective PhD students are looking for supervisors or finishing their semester and like contemplating on where to apply for. And usually, they would give a response by, February, March, that hey, you're admitted to the program, provisional offer, yes or no, and then from then you start a process of enrollment and whatnot.
Yeah, and it just depends too on the program, right? So when you submit the application in the fall, November, December, some programs have no interview. And so in some programs, you get admitted just based on the application, which I do not enjoy. I'm having them change that, the social program at Minnesota. In some programs, there is an interview process. And so you make like the short list, and then you're interviewed, and then post-interview, you get admitted. And during the interview process, oftentimes you're brought on campus if you're in the US. It's like a campus visit where you come to campus, you meet other prospective students, you get to interact more with your potential supervisor. And yeah, and offers usually go out depending on around February, March.
Right.
And it's expensive. Yeah, it's an expensive process. The average application in the US at least is $100, like per school that you're applying for. And if you take the GRE is like $160. I think it's more expensive. I think it's like $200 actually, and $40. If you send in your scores to schools, it's often like $25 per school that you're sending it to. You also need your official transcripts. Again, I don't know how much it costs, but in the US, the one transcript costs like $10. It's like you just send it an email. Yeah, it's like $10. And so I remember when I applied, it probably cost me like $1,500 US. It's like apply for like 13 schools or something. Probably more. Actually.
But don't be too fearful yet. Don't run it from the PhD. There's not only North America.
Yeah.
In France, this does not exist. You don't need to pay for an application. The only thing I paid, and even then, there's the cost of the train to do my audition for my scholarship, application. That's about it. So if you're where money's a problem, you can always learn French. The Alliance Française, gonna plug them in here. It's probably cheaper to go down that route. Right. So in the interest of time, you can probably go on to the next part. All right. So someone asked this question a while ago, I believe. How do we, the application is in, what are we looking at? What are we looking for? So Drexler, maybe you can take the lead on this one because you have more experience, maybe.
Oh yeah, and it depends on there are individual differences even within the same program and some in like a social program. So some of my colleagues want people who have demonstrated research experience. And so the person was in a research lab, or they presented a poster, or they were like a co-author on a paper. And so there is some evidence that the individual has done research. I look for just intellectual curiosity. And so I am more focused on the people who are interested in the work that I'm interested in and kind of think about it in a similar way. And so I had one student from India, one of my students from Cyprus. I just recruited a student from China, one of my students American. And so I am just looking for people who think about social psychology, past the US context. And so that excites me. And you can teach someone how to run a correlation. You can teach someone how to design a study. But I think intrinsic motivation and just interest and passion, you can't teach. And so I look for that.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think there's a lot of soft skills I also look for. I'm a firm believer that in North America, the GPs are overinflated anyway, so no point looking at grades. I'm not, they all have A's anyway at McGill, so it doesn't make a big difference. How do you determine or discern between a 98 and a 96, on a transcript? It's so hard. So a lot of the soft skills are really important. You want to be able to demonstrate that, you're resilient so that you start this PhD program and you're going to stay on board for as long as it takes. And you want to show that, of course, an intellectual curiosity that this is something that you're excited about and genuinely will want to pursue. And because there's an investment on our parts, big investment. So we want to make sure that, the persons that are there are generally want to be there.
Yeah. And I think it's it too. So some people want, applicants who can just hit the ground running. And so it's if, I'm going to bring you in my lab, you should be able to just pick up a study and run it immediately. And so that's one approach. Other people are looking for people able to at least submit an IRB application in the first semester. Other people allow the students to just explore in the first year. And I always tell my students, in your first year, you should be submitting one paper at least. And so that's just the approach that I take. It's submit one paper.
Yeah.
And other people, you cannot submit a paper, and that's fine. And other people expect you to submit 3 papers. And so that's why those interviews are important and getting to know the expectations of your mentor are.
Yeah, for this part, I think there's a lot of heterogeneity. So I don't know if there are questions. If there are any questions, if not, we can pass on to the other side.
There are a list of universities in France that offer PhDs in English and also virtually. And so.
Okay, so this is a question directed to me. So So the language of instruction in English and virtually. So the good thing with the PhD is that the classes, the emphasis is less on the emphasis is more on the research than on the classes. So in my team, when I was in my postdoc in Paris, in some units, so we had people from, there's a guy, Sehun, was from, I think, South Korea, who I don't believe, when I was there, his French wasn't all that developed yet. So he was able to enroll and do his research because he supervised, of course, all of us, speak some degree of English in the lab. The process of actually following the workshops and stuff might be challenging, but there's always a way around that because you can get exemptions to follow courses outside of the university's courses. But to be very brief, it is possible. There are a lot of non-native speakers who pursue PhDs in France, and I think the policy now is to bring in more of those profiles. So it's not a problem.
What about the remote part?
But the remote, so I did my PhD remotely, actually, in Guadeloupe. So my university is in a place called Rennes, in the Atlantic side of France. I was enrolled there for 3 years, but physically resided in Guadeloupe for 3 years. During that time, the full thing. So you just required me to go to the school maybe once or twice a year for mandatory, seminars or presentations. And that's, was the lab where I was in. I was lucky that they had a good budget and was able to find me in and out when needed. So yes, it's very possible. There's a lot of flexibility because unlike in the US and Canada, where there's a strict class courses that you have to follow in a very programmatic fashion, it's kind of like a la carte where you kind of compose your PhD as you see fit. It's like, so there's a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. In North America, the answer is no. You can't do a PhD remotely. The only time one is able to do part of it remotely often is post-candidacy after you've proposed your dissertation and you're writing it up. And so often they will allow, and we'll go into that next, funding and how that operates. And when you're writing your PhD prospectus, that is when you don't have to be around physically. But generally, you can't do a PhD remotely in the US.
Yeah. So to add,
again, not a professional doctorate, just like a PhD. That's not. Yeah.
I just wanted to add. So I did mine remotely, but I moved to Guadeloupe because my supervisor was there physically in the country. So the school, there's a physical distance from the school, but the person who is charged with my mentorship and my supervision and my development, my training was there with me in the lab. We were in the same space for 3 years. So, if you have a supervisor who resides in Saint Lucia, who can supervise you, and your school is in University of, Paris-Saclay, which is, that can work. That can work very well. We just need to find someone who's physically in Saint Lucia who would like to supervise you.
Yeah, and so professional PhDs really just focus on practice. And so as I brought up the example of psychology, so if you have a professional degree in clinical psychology, most of the classes and the content will focus on assessment, therapy, CBT types of therapy. A lot of the students, and I know this because I'm teaching, I taught a class in a professional psych class this past semester degree, and I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. And so the classes focus on assessment, therapy. They do practical during their time there. It's also 5 years, and so it's more practice focused versus in a PhD program where you don't have to do any of that. And the focus is on doing research and advancing theory. And so the only thing that's practical that you do is only to meet AP, American Psychological Association requirements, but it's not the expectation that after you get your PhD that you will practice. In fact, a lot of my colleagues who are PhD in clinical and counseling psychology do not practice, have never practiced, and we hire practitioners to mentor students for clinical training. And so people in my department and even mentor students on clinical training because they all have PhDs and they just don't care about it. And so that's the difference there. One is very practice focused and the other one is very theory focused. And a lot of my colleagues will, I'll just stop. But in terms of, and so even when you're applying to PhD programs, it's something we read between the lines of your application. And so if your application sounds too practice focused, you're probably not gonna get admitted because that requires a different level of thinking, but also the motivation and the passion for research is what we're looking for.
Okay, so now that we are in the PhD program, we're enrolled, let's talk about funding and scholarships. So first question one, do I have to pay? So it's a yes or no question. Kind of if you want to pay, you can pay.
In mental health, I guess you're paying for that.
So in terms of payment, we're thinking of like, the covering tuition and living expenses. So if it's just I can speak for France, for example, usually in natural sciences and public health, with the status quo is to have funding to do that. So in which case you have a living allowance from the scholarship you'd have gotten, but then you'd have to pay tuition, unfortunately. But tuition is 400 euros, so it's you save up a money every month, you can make that without a problem. In North America, it's a bit different.
Yeah, and so North America, it's very different. It depends on your funding package. And the distribution of funding packages naturally depend on the program. So if they get like biology, biomedical engineering, history, or psychology. So I'll just give like a general overview. One model of funding is that you apply to work with a mentor, and your mentor has federal funding. And so your mentor pays your tuition, and your mentor gives you a stipend. And so that's a mentorship model where being admitted to the program is on the behest of your mentor having funding. And even in psychology, that's different. I have some colleagues who are at Carnegie Mellon, and they can't admit psych PhD students unless they have the funding. And that funding has to cover tuition and a living stipend. And so that's one approach. The other way that funding happens in the US is through being a teaching assistant. And so if you're a teaching assistant, oftentimes you're holding office hours and grading. And so with the teaching assistantship, it comes with a tuition waiver. And so you don't have to pay tuition, and you get a stipend. And those stipends vary. There's a lot of that. Anyway, and so the stipend is usually on average like $25,000 a year. And so enough to live in an apartment with roommates taking care of yourself. It's not, you're not going to be going to Saint Lucia every other holiday. And you also can't like have a family on it. And because the PhD is full-time, you'll have to quit your job. Some people used to work, undercover as like bartenders when I was in grad school. So we're making 17 grand a year in Chicago. But and so those are how it's. And so we always say this, any reputable program in the PhD program in the US is going to be free. And so if you have to pay for a PhD, you probably don't want to get your PhD there. There will be money available. And so oftentimes for TA-ships or teaching assistantships are always like a research assistantship. And so I know the biomedical sciences, the natural sciences, oftentimes being a research assistant, in the humanities, social sciences, often is being a teaching assistant. Either way, you're getting paid.
So I don't want to just plug in here. So, and this is also very discipline specific, right? So in the case of France, so we nationally recognize that there's certain areas of priority areas where the state is pumping in money for research and innovation. So for example, in cancer research alone, there is like 3 distinct entities where they dish out PhD scholarships nonstop every year consistently. And maybe somewhere in people who are doing, I don't know, English literature might get less funding because there's less agencies who are channeling money together. So it's just, and there's also the scholarships, we call it bourse chiffres. So this is basically a specific mechanism by which your PhD would be dually funded by the university and by some industry partner. So if you're into, I don't know, AI, you could end up, some company that you're working in will decide to fund half of your PhD, and then the university fund another half. So there's this mechanism that exists, and there are like a lot of others I can go into, but in the interest of time, we can do that at the end, or we can linger on and ask questions if needed.
Yeah, and generally, no, you can't work part-time. You can't have another job. It's considered a full-time job. And even for visa purposes, if you're in the US, you can't work off campus, especially given that TA ships to get a tuition waiver at 50%. And so you're only allowed to work 20 hours a week anyway. And so in the US, at least, working part-time would mean that you're violating like your visa.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing to add to say, because even in France, I was a PhD student, but since I was looking for a national research lab, I was employed under contracts. So I was actual worker within their organization. So it's not just I'm a student, but I'll simultaneously enroll in a university, yes, as a PhD student, but this is a recognized job where you have a contract, you have right to leave, right to vacation, rights to social security, insurance, et cetera. So, just to show you how they see it, in that context as an actual job. So you can probably go to the next section, which speaks to program structure and duration. So we spoke about milestones a while ago, so about the dissertation. In North America, there's a lot of structure that goes into it. So it's not like à la carte, like, we do in France. So you would end up having to do a qualifying exam. At McGill, I believe, for our PhDs at the end of the first year. So you call it a comprehensive exam where, I want to see the students able to meet that minimum threshold before they start doing their research. Then there's a point where they would maybe have a protocol defense. That happens a lot in public health, I did for psych as well. And then when you're done doing your research at the end of that, those usually 3 years, you would have a dissertation defense, which, depending on the context you are, can take different shapes or forms, but, it's a very exciting moment for the PhD student and, the person supervising, where you have a panel of experts who will kind of judge you and they make a deliberation at the end, whether or not you're granted a PhD or not.
Yeah, and I'll just get the global answering all questions at the same time. So it depends on the program you're in. So in some programs, you don't have to take any courses. Some programs, you do have to take courses. So there's that. Some programs will take 10 courses, other programs will take 5. And so there's variability there. Milestones, we talked about earlier. Some programs you have to do a master's thesis, other programs you don't have to do a master's thesis. But for all programs, you have to do what's called a qualifying exam. And so you're in a PhD program until you take your qualifying exam, and then you become a PhD candidate. And so that just signals that you're ready to propose your dissertation or write your dissertation. We touched on, can I do my PhD remotely? Generally, no, with an asterisk, right? So depending on nuanced situations. Do I have to publish research while getting my PhD? In the US, yes. If I have a student who's not, I don't know, I'll be failed. Yeah, if I have a student in 5 years and you haven't published anything, well, I think you probably won't get to 5 years and I can't imagine it. Because by year 3, we're probably having a discussion about whether you belong in the program or not. And so the answer in the US, at least from my experience, is that you have to publish. My student is in her 2nd year and she has 2 papers in the revision, 3 papers in the review. And so I can't imagine being in your 5th year with nothing. And so categorically, yes, in my context, at least.
So imagine we spoke about apprenticeship a while ago, just to give an idea what this looks like. So imagine you're going to baking school to be a baker, and by the end of 2 years, you cannot bake bread. That's what it sounds like to us.
Yeah.
You really need to do that. That's part of the job you need to know to publish something. In terms of, France, this looks a little bit different. So coursework, we have coursework, but it's not as structured. So the notion of exams doesn't really exist. There's a certain minimum number of hours that you need to complete, and it could take the form of workshops, seminars, presentations, even teaching counts as part of your training. So those teaching hours goes into your training hours. And usually the training hours over the 3 years is between 100 and 150 training hours minimal. And you can do everything in your first year and be like, I'm done with this. Okay, just done it over. Or you can be like, okay, I want to space myself out, do 50 here, 50 here, 25 there. And it's up to you. Just make sure it needs to be, before you sending your dissertation, these hours need to be completed before that. But apart from that, it's all good.
Yeah, nothing Keith mentioned, the US is very structured. And so at the end of every year, we do an evaluation of students. In social psychology, we evaluated all students in the program by year, first, second, third year. It's are they reaching the milestones? And if you're not reaching the milestones, then there is some discussion that needs to happen because it's about progress. I told my students 5 years, after 5 years, I don't know if I can mentor you again. I'm committing to 5 years, so let's get things done. And so that's my approach. And other people are you can spend 6 years and 7 years.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just the baby has died. It's come to term. We need to move on. Okay.
So if there's any questions on teaching, you can probably move
questions
on. At least on teaching specifically. Yeah. If not, we can take them afterwards. Okay. Okay, so this is the last one. We can open the general Q&A. So international students, what are the visa requirements for international PhD students? This is a tricky one. I know for Canada, this is a problem, right? Immigration just seems to getting harder and harder. And I haven't been there for that long, but definitely, yes, we do need a visa. I don't know what that looks like specifically because I arrived there as a professor. I know for France, usually you need a visa to enter, but I get a feeling that it's not as cutthroat as the Canadian and Quebec immigration services. And that's something to think of. You can maybe speak more on your experience.
Yeah, in the US, you're on an F1 and an F1 visa, like undergrad, master's, PhD. And so when you're going to Barbados to get like your visa, because PhD programs are fully funded in the US, you'll get your SEVIs. And so you'll have all the documents showing how your PhD will be paid for. You don't have to show any funds. You don't have to show how you're going to support yourself. All that will be sent by the school and you just like take it to Barbados. I think that's probably one of the easiest. You have no trouble with oftentimes. It's like an F1 student visa. I think it's probably one of the most fun.
I get a feeling in Canada, we have like just a little parenthesis. We have like postdocs who come in, like full-grown adults with like money, and even then it's particularly difficult to get them in. So we definitely have a problem.
Oh yeah.
In France, when you come in as a PhD student, you're considered to be a researcher or talent. So there is this like streamlined process in terms of visas to get one. And in Saint Lucia, we're very lucky. We have our French embassy situated here, so we don't have to fly out to Barbados or anywhere to get it done. So whether you're right there in VG, we'll plug in for the French embassy.
Yeah, and so that's right. And can I bring my family with me? Oh, you can add dependents on like your F1 student visa, but your dependents can't work. And as I said earlier, like your stipend is probably going to be like $25,000 a year. And so if you have enough savings or you think that you can support your family on that yearly stipend, then yeah, bring them, especially if you think in here like 4 or 5 years. I know people who brought over their family, enroll their kids in school while they're completing their degree. And so it is possible, assuming you have the resources. But yeah, but also remember that it's a full-time job for like 4 or 5 years or whatever. Yeah, because there is like it communicates that the individual hasn't done research. And I think that's the idea. So if you're emailing me about enrolling into a PhD program to do research with me, the bare minimum is you've read my research. And so if you haven't read my research, clearly you're not ready to be a researcher. And so it's telling in and of itself, if someone is just like sending you an email, I want to be a student. I have no idea what you do. And so that's why I particularly respond to the people who have some content in the email about something that I do. It's like, okay, you've read, you're actually very curious, and because it's all about intellectual curiosity. It depends on the program. So at UIC, where I got my PhD, it was part of it. And even though it was part of it, it was optional. So if you wanted to do it, you did it. At the University of Minnesota, we have no formal master's program, as in writing a master's thesis and defending it. We have a plan. I guess we have a plan A, we don't do it. But the plan B is just like submitting all your coursework and term papers up to a point, and then you're awarded a master's degree. And so there's a formal master's thesis in some programs, in other programs, there's not. And I think it's because, again, the idea, and maybe we need to revisit the idea, is that an individual has committed to completing a PhD. And so what's the point in awarding you a master's degree if we know for sure, and again, I use that loosely, if you know for sure you're gonna get it. And so that's the difference. Yeah. Yes, and those, and those are significant issues actually in the US. And so my graduate school mentor left Chicago and went to UC Santa Cruz, and for 3 years she couldn't recruit a student because the stipend was like $23,000 and you're living in California, and UC Santa Cruz is probably like 20 miles or so from Silicon Valley. And so you have all the Facebook people making money, cost of living is expensive, and you're trying to recruit someone living on $20,000 a year. At the University of Minnesota, the graduate students just unionized this past year to increase living stipends, because for a lot of the students, they made $20,000 a year. And trying to live in Minneapolis on $20,000 a year, it's almost impossible. When I was in Chicago, our stipend was $17,000 a year. And so I lived, thank God I had friends. Yeah, lived in Chicago on $17,000 a year. And so, yeah, it is a problem. And I think some of my older colleagues might just say that you're doing it because you're passionate and the money is not important, blah, blah. Yeah, and that's one of the approaches that people have. There's also great tension because we were just talking about this, you receive a tuition waiver. And so for the university, in the university's eyes, you're actually getting paid like $70,000 a year. That's how they see it, because they're like, well, we're covering your tuition. And as an international student, your tuition is $40,000 a year. But then we're giving you $25,000 because you're a teaching assistant. And so you're actually making $65,000 a year. And so there's that. But then you have people who are at Michigan making $30,000 a year, and you can, live in Ann Arbor, which is relatively expensive, but cheaper than Chicago. And so, yeah, those are major, major factors, and we deal with it in our program too.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight our partners from the French Embassy who just walked in. Can you just say hello quickly? Right. So they're avid supporters of what we're doing. And since, we're speaking all about France this morning, it's and none of us all excited to do a PG in France. You can always have a word with them afterwards on processes and visas and whatnot, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for this, we want to go to the next segment, which has to do with our graduate students who have all prepared a few research talks for you, like flash presentations. So it's an exercise for them to get a chance to expose their work to an audience in here in Saint Lucia, which we don't do often enough. And also we want to give you the moment to just a Q&A at the end to ask them, what's it like being in grad school? How did they get here? And, just to get some questions going. So without further ado, I'm going to just give in this order. So Stephen, first the master student, Stephen, Boris, and the PhD students would have Nicolas and Stacia to finish off with her. And then the Q&A will close off this segments.
Good day, everyone. My name is Stephen, and I'm working with Prof. Auguste on the cataract study. We are specifically focusing on, my project is focusing on the perception and attitude towards cancer control research among stakeholders in Saint Lucia. So I mentioned my name earlier. I'm Stephen Benyi Johnson. I'm from Ghana. I schooled in Ghana. I had all my education in Ghana. My bachelor's degree was in Ghana. And I studied health information management at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. But now I'm at McGill University studying for my master's degree in public health, which is funded by the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program at McGill University. And my research interest is in social determinants of health, specifically health literacy and health equity. So for my research topic, perception and attitude towards cancer research in Saint Lucia among stakeholders. The aim is to explore how stakeholders perceive cancer-related research and their attitude towards the evidence that is produced from such study. So we want to know whether they think that the research or the study that is produced here answers their question. Is it relevant to them? Do they think that the study is important? Is it answering their research questions? And do they even use it to make informed decisions when they are doing policies that are related to cancer treatment? And so we have these two aims. And the second one is to identify some of the barriers that they think is hindering them from participating in studies in Saint Lucia. So for this study, we hypothesized or we assumed that stakeholders do not see the cancer studies that they produce here. I don't even know if they are cancer studies being produced, but they think, we are assuming that they think it is not relevant to them because they don't answer their questions. So we want to talk to them and then see what are the barriers that they think are stopping them from being engaged in research. So that's the hypothesis that we came up with. And to the problem that we think is there is that cancer mortality is high in Saint Lucia, but then the stakeholder engagement with cancer research is very low. And also there is a gap between like how there is a gap between understanding like how stakeholders perceive cancer and the cancer research and then utilize the evidence that is produced. So we want to investigate stakeholders' attitude towards cancer research, identify their barriers to engagement, and then improve the application of research findings in practical decision making. So these are the research questions that we have for this study. We want to know what the perception and attitude stakeholders have towards cancer research in Saint Lucia. We also want to know the factors that influence stakeholders' willingness or reluctance to engage in cancer research in Saint Lucia. We also want to know what key stakeholders in Saint Lucia currently, how they are able to access and interpret and use cancer research or cancer information. And then we also want to know the knowledge translation strategies that they think will be effective for them to better engage research in Saint Lucia. And also the last one is we want to know the perceived barriers or facilitators that they think if it's solved, they could better engage with research. To answer these questions, I am going to employ this study design. I'm going to do a qualitative study where I would, to answer this question, I'm going to do a qualitative study to provide a fundamental understanding of this topic, because I think there is not enough information on how or perception and attitude of stakeholders in Saint Lucia specifically towards cancer research. So we want to know and understand the basic things, just to also get to see how we can bring the stakeholders together to know which of the stakeholders are the key stakeholders. So I'm going to do a stakeholder analysis where I will add the stakeholder analysis to the qualitative study. And then the study is going to take place in Saint Lucia. The participants are going to be stakeholders from Saint Lucia. So stakeholders like the cancer patients, the cancer health professionals, the Minister of Health, if he's available, the Chief Medical Officer, insurance companies. So people from these groups will be purposively selected, so that we want to purposively select them so that they can provide us with the information that we need to answer the questions that we are trying to find answers to in this study. And I'm also going to use an interview guide to collect my data from these key stakeholders. And after the data is collected, I'm going to do an analysis. First of all, I'm going to do a stakeholder analysis where I'll do the stakeholder mapping to develop the power to interest matrix, which will help to identify which stakeholders to keep informed and which of them to keep empowered and engaged in the CASIDEC study, so that the study does not just end with the production of the research paper, but that the knowledge that is produced will be taken up and used in decision-making concerning cancer treatment in Saint Lucia. And I also conduct a thematic analysis on the interviews that I'm going to be taking in a few days. Okay, so at the end of my study, what I hope to achieve is that I would be able to analyze the stakeholders' engagement in Saint Lucia by assessing their influence and power in the CASIDEC study, and also to identify and recommend to the CASIDEC study the knowledge translation strategies that they could implement to enhance stakeholders' access to research findings on cancer control and treatment, and also to recommend to the CASIDEC study strategies that they can put in place to ensure stakeholders' commitment to research in Saint Lucia. So the overall goal is to ensure that the cancer stakeholders in Saint Lucia become more engaged in research, and that ultimately they would use the evidence produced from research to make evidence-informed decisions and then policies in Saint Lucia to enhance cancer control and treatment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Boris Atabe. I'm very grateful to be here today. I'll be speaking a little bit on my academic journey and a little bit on the research work that I'm currently doing under the supervision of Professor Aviane Auguste. We're investigating the association between personal medical history and head and neck cancer in the French West Indies. So who am I? I'm a first-generation immigrant who moved from Cameroon, West Africa to Canada about 10 years ago with my family. My basic and secondary education was split between Cameroon and Canada. And after my high school, I went to go complete a bachelor's in science degree in pharmacology at McGill, during which I fell in love with public health and epidemiology during my last year in undergrad after working in an ALS lab. Then after that, I applied to do my master's degree in public health in McGill University, which I'm currently doing, which I met Professor Aviane. While doing my master's degree, my research interests have hovered around topics of infectious diseases, tropical diseases, and global health. So a little bit of background and rationale into my project and kind of the context of head and neck cancer currently in the French West Indies, specifically Martinique and Guadeloupe. So head and neck cancer are among the 6 most common cancers worldwide, with Martinique and Guadeloupe having the highest incidence rates in Latin America and in the Caribbean. The risk factors for head and neck cancer include tobacco use, alcohol consumption, as well as occupational exposures such as wood dust and fine dust particles. Over the years, reduced smoking and alcohol intake has led to a decrease in the incidence of head and neck cancer in France, which is the status quo for the study. However, the incidence and mortality of HIV-positive cancer is still on the rise, or has been rising. Looking into the literature on this subject, it is well established that at the molecular level, pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are present in inflammatory and infectious disease formation, play a key role in the development of head and neck cancer. Consequently, understanding these mechanisms, so mechanisms like inflammation and immunity that drive head and neck cancer, is increasingly important in cancer prevention and survival, since even though the incidence of head and neck cancer is higher in developed countries, mortality rates are still highest in developing countries. So basically, my project has as a primary aim to investigate the association between personal medical history and head and neck cancer in Guadeloupe and Martinique, so the French West Indies. But additionally, I also want to assess the role of HPV infection in the relationship between personal medical history and head and neck cancer, and also to evaluate the potential interaction between personal medical history and lifestyle risk factors such as alcohol consumption and tobacco use. My a priori hypothesis for this study is that personal medical history will increase the risk of head and neck cancer in the French West Indies, reaching a greater effect size than other non-Black populations. So to attain my objective, I'll be conducting a secondary analysis using data from a population-based case control study, which is called the ECAL-C study, which is part of the larger enhanced consortium. My cases, which are 144 individuals, were identified from cancer registries for Martinique and Guadeloupe, and they were frequently matched by age and by sex to the controls, which are 405 individuals who were selected from the general population in Martinique and Guadeloupe. The statistical method I'm going to be using for this analysis is a multivariate logistic regression, where my exposure variable is going to be personal medical history, so inflammatory and infectious diseases, including candidiasis, herpes, tuberculosis, nasal polyps, chronic bronchitis, and asthma. Meanwhile, my outcome is going to be head and neck cancer. And then during my analysis, I'm also going to control for confounders such as age, sex, socioeconomic status, alcohol consumption, occupational exposures, just to make sure that these variables do not create any porous association between my exposure and my outcome of interest. And so looking in terms of the outcome, sadly, I do not have any outcomes to present to you today because I'm still in my data analysis phase. Hopefully, maybe next year, if Prof is not fed up with me, he might bring me back to present the results. But yeah, basically, I'm hoping that by the end, my findings will be able to, help contribute to the understanding of the drivers of the observed racial disparities and will help to develop approaches in reducing these disparities for head and neck, in the case of head and neck cancer, especially in the French West Indies. I also like my findings to not only contribute on a global level, but also on the regional level for cancer control strategies. And lastly, I would like for these findings to help improve early cancer detection and to inform cancer screening protocols. So these are my references, and thank you.
Okay, so good morning, bonjour. So my name is Nicolas Pallud, and I'm a doctoral candidate in Anglophone Studies at Université Paris-Créteil. Today, I'm going to discuss the ways in which I adapted ethnographic methodology to the obstacles and opportunities encountered during my fieldwork in Guadeloupe. Okay, so I'll start by providing you with some contextual information about my research project and follow up with a presentation of the methodology that I've been using to carry it out. So for context, my research project focuses on carnival as a potential means of legitimizing queer expressions and identities in Guadeloupe and Saint Lucia. And my main research question is the following: to what extent do the carnival celebrations in Guadeloupe and Saint Lucia respectively contribute to the legitimization of queer identities and expression in these territories? So although my project focuses on both on Guadeloupe and Saint Lucia, I'll be discussing the fieldwork carried out in Guadeloupe, since I haven't started my fieldwork in Saint Lucia yet. I just learned it yesterday. So as we all know, thank you. As we all know, Carnival is a major cultural event in the Caribbean. It's organized by both private and public stakeholders. In Guadeloupe, Carnival is organized and overseen by the Guadeloupe Island Tourism Office, l'Office du Tourisme Visible de Guadeloupe, along with a multitude of federations, collectives, and committees, as you can see here. In Guadeloupe, Carnival lasts between 2 and 3 months, from January to March or from January to February, depending on the year, with 1 to 3 events per week throughout the Carnival season. Carnival has historically allowed people to transgress social norms. In the case of Guadeloupe, it grants individuals and communities the opportunity to express their queerness publicly. And by queerness, I refer here to any gender or sexual identity or expression that challenges heteronormativity. Yeah, okay. So the main objective of this project is to evaluate whether the cultural expression of highly marginalized groups, in this case, queer communities, is legitimized in Guadeloupean society through a widely valued and recognized cultural event, which is Carnival. Guadeloupe is a French overseas department where sex and gender-based discrimination is punishable by law. Nonetheless, queerphobia remains a social issue in that territory, which indicates that ending queerphobia requires more than just legislation. And it's for that reason that I've decided to focus on the social and cultural dynamics of Guadeloupe and how such dynamics influence the visibility and acceptance of queer expressions, particularly within Carnival, an event that's been historically conducive to social transgression. My project draws on James Scott's theory of anthropolitics, which highlights the significance and strategic value of hidden, disguised, or covert forms of resistance, such as Carnival. To carry out this project, I decided to conduct archival research and ethnography, which itself combines observation and semi-structured interviews. Sorry, for my, as far as the archival research is concerned, I use it in part to complement my fieldwork. Ultimately, I wanted to help me situate queer expressions in Guadeloupe within its historical context, and help me determine whether the theme of queer expressions within Carnival is even covered in the press at all, because I'm doing archival research on press. And if so, I also want to see how it is perceived socially through my archival research. I aim to analyze articles published between 1950 and 2025 from Guadeloupe's most prominent newspapers, La Nouvelle de Guadeloupe and France Guadeloupe. So why this time frame, you may ask? Why 1950 to 2025? Because it's around that time that Guadeloupe and Saint Lucia carnivals experienced renewed popularity and became more institutionalized. So far, I've extracted all the articles pertaining to Carnival, to Guadeloupe's Carnival, published between 1950 and 1982. Observation. So I conducted 63 hours of observation within 2 carnival bands, Vim and Double Face. These 2 bands exemplify 2 distinct types of bands within Guadeloupe's carnival ecosystem, if I may say. Vim is what we call un groupe à peau, and double face is a groupe à casquette. So you can see like artistically, they're very different. Observe both groups during their respective parades, organizing meetings, and workshops. Some of the most valuable insights emerged from unexpected moments during my fieldwork, and information I initially deemed unimportant later proved to be highly relevant. Finally, my semi-structured interviews. So I conducted 10 individual semi-structured interviews with carnival participants identifying as queer, as well as with leaders or members of local pro-LGBT organizations. The main goal of these interviews were to understand the lived experiences of queer individuals in Guadeloupe and whether carnival participation offered them some social legitimacy. Most interviews were conducted in person and a few were held online for logistical, practical reasons, and all were recorded using a digital recorder, of course. That's it. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Good morning again. My name is Stacia Ali, and I am the Institutional Research Officer here at Saint Lucia Community College. In addition to that, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine in Trinidad. My research area lies with education and educational psychology. So my research is looking at an in-depth investigation into first-year undergraduate students' social and personal emotional adjustment to university. A lot of times, focus is placed on academic outcomes, and little attention is looking at students' social and emotional adjustment, these experiences that they have at university. So my research question, just two of them on this presentation, looks at how first-year undergraduate students are adjusting to university from a social and personal emotional perspective. And in addition to that, it also looks at the ways in which these issues affect their adjustment and their overall university experience. And to answer these research questions, I did a case study. And this case study included a total of 25 students, as you can see here. These students span across different Caribbean nationalities and different faculties at that university in Trinidad. So we have a total of 15 from Trinidad, 1 from Tobago, 2 from Saint Lucia, which I just want to highlight is those two students are alumni from our very own Saint Lucia Community College. 2 from St. Vincent, 1 from St. Kitts, Dominica, Guyana, Grenada, Antigua. So the intention here was to really get that Caribbean perspective to see how they are adjusting socially and emotionally. So for research question 1, that emotional adjustment, that was categorized into different themes. So those with positive expressions of emotional adjustment, they talked about things like feeling confident in their experience so far, happiness, signs of resilience, high emotional intelligence, strong support systems, and especially, this one was a bit interesting to me, students with work experience were having more positive emotional experiences at university. On the flip side, those with more negative expressions of emotions had strong feelings of anxiety, depression, high stress levels, feelings of loneliness, low academic self-concept, and difficulty with time management. In terms of the social aspect now, positive expressions were establishing friendships. People who were able to establish friendships had a better social experience. Those that were able to maintain existing friendships even prior to university. Students that are able to adapt to the diversity of student population at the university, those with active social life, and those that had good social skills, all had sentiments of positive social adjustment in comparison to those with difficulty establishing friendships, those with difficulty adjusting to diversity, Class size, as you know, universities have very large class sizes. Those that had issues with that had some negative social adjustment, those with limited social engagements, and what they would describe as poor social skills. In terms of research question 2, so how does these issues that we identify affect or influence their ability to adjust? So those students that experience difficulty with their personal emotional adjustment, they had unhealthy habits. So for example, difficulty sleeping, they had poor diets, they had medical issues. A lot of them had to go to doctors and whatnot for different medical issues, all related to their experience at university. And of course, experiencing high emotional distress. In addition to all of that, from the social part of it now, difficulty adjusting socially led to exclusion from social activities, whether it be small activities, large activities, anything at all, it led to exclusion. It also led to the lack of interest in wanting to initiate friendships or interest in participating in campus activities. I touched on that already, lack of initiation of friendships. So altogether, we are seeing that the experiences that students have socially, it has impact on their adjustment to university. And of course, what they experience emotionally has impact on their experience as well. So altogether, the purpose of this research is to really understand their social and emotional experiences within this university settings. Thank you for your time and attention.
Drexler and I spoke a lot about the professor sides of thing, how we see admission to PhD program. I know maybe I could open a question to Nicolas, who's done a lot of studying, well, he's in France currently doing his PhD. Can you just walk us through your journey and how you got from a master's degree to where you are now?
Okay, so I did master's degree in Anglophone studies back in 2020. After that, I did a master's in teaching. I taught as an English teacher in high school for 2 years. And during that time, research was always my ultimate goal. So I was thinking about it. In the end, what I did was I was looking for supervisor. So I just went online. There's a website called Institut des Amériques, where a lot of professors in Anglophone studies, you have their contact information over there. So I went there and I just, copy pasted emails and I texted every single one of them, anyone and everyone that would be willing to listen to me. So I sent them an email with a draft of my project, 4-page draft that Dr. Auguste helped me write, by the way. So I sent that over. And, little by little, I had some Zoom meetings with the professor in Montpellier, other friends who referenced me to a colleague in UPEC who ended up being my supervisor. So that's how it happened. Yeah. And other than that, I also had to apply for funding. And as Dr. Auguste said, there's a lot of disparity between the fields in social sciences and, sociology and all that. We don't have a lot of funding. So it's quite competitive. I was supposed to apply for 4. I applied for 3. I got a 3rd one, and that's it. That's what happened. So I had to present my work before jury and all that stuff.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because in the US we have this system where you apply and the most you may get is an interview, right? And then in France it's more like you have to audition. You have to kind of put on a presentation that lasts, around 10 minutes or so.
Yes, and then there's a series of questions. You have to convince them. You have to show. What they say is they give you your funding depending on how the excellence or the quality of your work. But the reality is depending on the jury, depending on their specialties, you might get the same result. For instance, the first jury I applied to, they didn't know nothing about the Caribbean, nothing about Carnival. So unfortunately, when I first prepared for that interview, I thought that it would have some concepts of what Carnival is and how important it is to us. So I didn't specify, how big it is of a deal here. And when they were all like, specialists in like middle age, historians or Latin and all that. So they knew nothing about the Caribbean. It was very hard to convince them that, it matters, so on and so forth. So it also depends on the people you have in front of you.
Okay, so any other questions or any PhD students wants to ask anything? Oh.
Good morning, everybody. I know you've spoken a bit about your journey, and I guess all of you can weigh into how do you select your area of study? I think I got this a little bit from you, but for the others, Stacia in particular, how did you arrive at that particular field?
Okay, so to select your area of interest, it must come naturally. It's not something you can force. It needs to be something that you feel strongly about. Where does that strong feeling come from? My answer would be from past experiences as well as observations. And because of past experiences, you are able to understand from your point of view, but as well as others. And it really, because again, a PhD, I would describe it as survival of the fittest. And there are times when you just don't want to do it, but if you don't have that innate passion towards it, you cannot do it. So it really must come from personal motivations.
Anybody else?
Okay, so for me to say I want to do public health and to be interested in health literacy is also comes from my background. I grew up in a rural area, so I know how it is to want to know something about health, and you don't know where to go because the hospitals are even very far from us. So you don't even know where to go to find the information. You go online and the internet is not even good for you to go online to search for the information. Yeah. So I felt like people getting sick mostly is because they are not literate when it comes to health. So I got interested in health literacy so that I were to give back to people in Ghana and help, especially rural areas, so that they can be able to be educated in health and be able to make decisions that will make like their health better for them. So that's why I wanted to do public health. And I came here and I did a lot of community work too, because I know that if for me to come out here and I need funding. And for me to get funding, I need to be good academically and then also outside school. So I combined school with doing volunteer jobs, like community work. Yeah. So that was how I got my scholarship in McGill, and I came to study public health. And Prof told me that, he wants me to do knowledge translation stuff. And I was reading papers on it, and I realized that, it links with my interest in health literacy, because I feel like knowledge translation is under health literacy. So if I'm able to do this project, I'm going to be able to learn more and maybe progress to do my PhD in health literacy, something in health literacy.
Oh, do I need to end? Yeah, I mean, in my case, I think it's a combination of everything they've said. Personal experience, rage, anger at systems and stuff. So I would say initially, when I was going through my bachelor's degree, I never had a set interest, but I just knew I wanted to change systems that have not been good enough to either the people I grew up with or underprivileged people in general. So when I got into the lab, which I mentioned in my last year of undergrad, I think it opened this new door to me, which I didn't know anything about. And I realized, I could use this field to at least contribute to some kind of change that I would like to see. in the world, and especially in the world where privileged people don't really understand what underprivileged people are going through. And so I think when I got into my program, and luckily enough, I did not have to go and look through websites. I found, I met Prof because he was the only Black prof that has ever taught me since I moved. So when I saw him, I was like, no way, I need to become his best friend. And so somehow his interest and my interest, we found an intersection. And I think with his help and mentorship, I'm where I am, today in terms of my career, academics. Yeah.
No questions tonight. Someone just said, congratulations to all of you on the Rookie from different perspectives.
Please don't move. We have our person, the French embassy or today would like to maybe some tokens of appreciation to our four students here. Some real honors are not going to
Okay, good morning or afternoon, I'm not sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Marouche Shonda Paul from the French Embassy. I work in the cultural department. So, and yes, I did my studies in France too. So I'm going to present you all with a small token from the embassy. I think there's enough to go around for everybody if I'm not mistaken, but yes, whatever's left, I will leave it. I don't believe.
That is it.
I think it's clear, right? Right.
So that's the theme of one of our. So that's the theme for, well, I guess it's for the year and also for some projects that we're working on, make it iconic. So it's our brand at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, okay, sorry. All right, so now we're back on here. So we can probably cut to close maybe. We all good, right? Okay, so bring this session to a close. I want to formally thank each and every one of you for coming here this morning.